The title of my talk is Wisdom Engaged Global Citizenship. So what I did in my paper are two things. At the beginning, to discuss is a little bit of some of the actually major problems of democracy, the way it has been practiced. And then I kind of connected with a candidate for the minimalist ethics drawn from Buddhist tradition. So starting from the issue of democracy, as we all know that democracy, together with other ideas like equality, fairness, freedom, and so on, has been understood as the most desirable form of social structure in our time. However, for democracy to function as it was designed to, fundamental elements in democracy need to be operating correctly. So as we all know, democracy means rule by the people, but the major problem, one of the major problem is that the people throughout the history of the practice of democracy has not included everybody. So in ancient time, that slaves and women were excluded. In the modern period, when bourgeoisies began to really emphasize this idea of equality for all, to challenging the aristocrats, again, those people, factory workers, all those people who do not have women, people of color, they were all excluded. And this kind of practice continues even today. So socially marginalized people are still excluded in our practice of democracy. And in discussing this, in my paper, I kind of engaged with two of modern Korean philosophers who actually made an interesting connection between the idea of logic in Western philosophy, formal logic, and then how this formal logic as a basis of Western philosophy actually is directly connected to this idea of exclusion in our concept of everybody or all, right? So I'm not going to obviously go into the details, but I think this is important aspects. We philosophers know that logic is important, but there are different ways of doing logic. And then Buddhist logic is also very different from Western formal logic, Aristotelian logic, and so on. And after discussing these two modern Korean thinkers, the differences of thinking emerged clearly. So for Korean thinkers, I used it as a kind of representatives of Asian philosophy or Buddhist philosophy. For them, the individual identity is not just a singular identity, it's a plural singular. One of the thinkers declares that I am plural singular. My singularity as an individual is not just a singular, which obviously is opposed to self-sufficient autonomous singular person in Western philosophy. And another kind of idea emerged from that discussion is that polarization of concept. For example, equality versus inequality, fairness versus unfairness. This kind of polarized concept actually works only as a theory, when in reality, if we really think about the reality, equality in real world, the situation is more complex, which means that instead of thinking about really the ideas and concepts, when we think about how to practice morality, we should really think about the practice itself, the action itself, how moral ideas become reality. So in this context, I try to propose a Buddhist idea of suffering as one candidate for the minimalist morality. And one of the reasons that I did was that when we think about moral values in our time, there are kind of certain kind of usual suspect, justice, truth, and so on and so forth. And I feel like these are the really valuable kind of ideas, but they have been really compromised in reality. So the polarization of the world become really real. I mean, Seoul, where I'm doing this presentation, in Seoul, in Korea, or Washington, D.C., where I live, the two different groups, liberals and conservatives, Democrats and the Republicans, abortionists and anti-abortionists, they march together protesting demanding justice and freedom and human dignity, but what they mean by that are totally almost opposite to each other. So in other words, these concepts have become more and more compromised. And I was looking for something which has at least the possibility of this kind of a compromise in reality. So with my background in Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, I was thinking about suffering. So from the very beginning of the tradition, the Buddhism was clear about the goal of Buddhist teaching, which is elimination of suffering. And to think about suffering as one of the kind of minimal measurement in our moral action has various benefits from my perspective. First one is that this idea of suffering as a minimum kind of idea to think about when we think about our behavior to other beings, it applies not only human animals, but it also applies to non-human animals. So as we all know, the famously Jeremy Bentham, when he talked about how human beings should treat animals, he says that we talk about whether animals can talk, whether animals can reason, but he says, well, the kind of fundamental issue should not be that. We should ask whether animals suffer. They do. Then there should be the kind of really minimalist the measurement when you think about how we should treat animals. And this idea of suffering can also be applied to the emerging kind of issue in our society, which is digital ethics. When you think about machine beings, now human animals, non-human animals, machine beings, AI, when you think about these beings, we can also think about, do they suffer? Perhaps we might not think about that way, these beings that way, but this is also very much applicable to this animal, the machine ethics or digital ethics. Obviously, I'm not going to get into details about this. So if we just think about the suffering as a minimalist ethics, it might sound very pessimistic, right? The good part, interesting part of Buddhism is that while the Buddhism kind of proposes suffering as a kind of a reality of existence, but at the same time, Buddhism proposed that everybody has a capacity to overcoming suffering, which Buddhism calls wisdom. So wisdom, obviously, in Buddhism is a kind of technical vocabulary, which is certain capacity that all beings kind of possess. So the issue from Buddhist perspective is not that whether somebody is capable of overcoming suffering, but then whether somebody can activate the capacity they have. So the Buddhist idea of endorsing this capacity of wisdom is really, I would define it as a radical equality. Buddhism says throughout the history, the Buddha, the enlightened being, so the best version that we can think of, and then just a normal being, an enlightened being. Both of them have same capacity, wisdom. So if we think about the best version of us and just a normal or even worse version of us have the same capacity, which is called wisdom, then here we can really think about the radical equality of all beings. Now, we all talk about equality all the time, but then without really actualizing it. But there is something, I think, that the Buddhist idea of radical equality is different from that. So here, the difference of that I'd like to pay attention to here is this. When you think about equality, justice, usually in Western philosophical tradition, these ideas belong to social political dimension, political philosophy. Whereas for long history of the Buddhism, for over 2,000 years history, rarely actually developed a very kind of systematized social political philosophy, even though they are talking about this radical equality. Because this the radical equality and justice issue in the Buddhism is always, most of cases, discussed at the individual's level, the practitioner's cultivation. And I think we can put this together. And this is a kind of possibility of creating Buddhist social political philosophy based on this Buddhist tradition of emphasizing radical equality of all beings, but at the same time emphasizing it in the context of individuals' cultivation of the capacity to behave like a moral agent. So I'm bringing in several different kind of ideas to make that argument. The first one is the well-known feminist arguments, the personal is the political. So individuals' cultivation is not limited to individual, that always has an influence on other people, and that will eventually have an influence on the social political dimensions, right? Now, another dimension is this interesting idea about Joseph Chan, the professor of University of Hong Kong. In his Confucian perfectionism, he talked about this kind of problem of democracy, the way that we practice it now. And he says that nowadays the education is based on civic education. The education trying to make a good citizen, but not pay attention to creating a good human being. And I think that he make a good point here. So it also has to do with our idea of nation state. So which one should we really pay attention to? Do we, is it the idea of a good citizen, or it is a good human being first who can be a good citizen in a nation state, or going beyond a nation state as a global citizen? So in a way that I put the title as a wisdom and engaged global citizenship, because democracy is possible only when there are virtuous leaders and virtuous voters, which would be the case in an ideal world, obviously. In the non-ideal world where we live, neither politicians nor voters possess a perfect virtue, or they possess only limited forms of virtue. So envisioning engaged global citizenship that would go beyond a nation state, while we all live in a nation state, would require viewing life from more fundamental level, which I would call the existential perspective, rather than social one or societal one, without negating or losing sight on the social problems we face in a nation state. And in such a situation, the minimal issue we can think of could be the Buddhist idea of suffering, one of the minimal issues, suffering, and its emphasis on wisdom as a capacity to overcoming suffering, and also its emphasis on the cultivation of this kind of capacity of overcoming suffering. So it is an approach that negates any kind of finalist one, which Professor Walls emphasized the kind of problem of this finalist one. Also paying attention to the process of how morality is exercised. This is also an approach that pays attention to local problem to solve the global problem. And that local issue include not only problems of different society, but also the issue of how individual members of a society comport themselves as a valued member of community. And in order for that to happen, the idea of self-cultivation could be the foundation of our moral deliberation. I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Any questions and comments? Jaime? Yes.
Hello, Professor Jim. I really enjoy your talk. I think your proposal of transitioning the Buddhist perspective of cultivating oneself to social political, I think is very meaningful. And also over the history, especially in modern times, let's think about how Buddhism engaged with human society. For example, like we call 人间佛教, Buddhism in the modern in the human world, something like that. And there are lots of social communal practice already trying to overcome what you call suffering. It's not just personal suffering. It's not just denying the outside social political pressure as a negative power, but trying to, as you said, trying to build a kind of social political motivation and to build a kind of actually Buddhist social structure in a way. And it has been a lot of ancient and modern practice on what you already mentioned. So I just want to ask you, I think you have been working so much on Korean and Japanese Buddhist, this kind of modern transition. This kind of past Buddhist experience to build up this social political structure, how can this kind of past experience be meaningful to what you call engaged global citizenship? Yeah, to modernize or something like that. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So yes, thank you very much for your comments and question. You're right. In modern period, as Buddhism encounter modernity starting from late 19th, especially early 20th century, and also as Buddhism encountered the West, this idea of Buddhism's social engagement became very popular. So engaged Buddhism in the West, engaged Buddhism became very popular, and still it is kind of developing. And also in the Chinese version, as you said, humanist Buddhism also deals with that issue. Now, to make a connection with this Buddhism's social engagement with the global, engaged global citizenship has to do, obviously, as it is, there's like a big gap between the two, right? Here's a Buddhist idea, and here's a global, engaged global citizenship. Now, but in a way that the gap might not be as huge as it might seem at the beginning, because when you think about the global citizenship, what do we mean by that? We cannot just get rid of a nation state. Nation state will be there, right, for a long time. But within that, we would like to kind of overcome the problems caused by this existence of nation state. Then what are the possibilities that we accomplish this? And one way of doing it is individual, go beyond the nation state, right, while still carrying a kind of American passport or Chinese passport. And in that way, so that's why I mentioned about this kind of very much existential level, the suffering, something like that. And then, so dealing with the question, the problems of nation state or society. For example, nowadays, American Buddhism is very active about this, right? So the challenging, for example, whiteness, the kind of racism of American society by using Buddhist idea. And that's a way of really connecting Buddhist kind of idea of suffering, wisdom, and the cultivation to deal with very important social issues like racism, right? Racism. And then this kind of approach, it cannot stop in American society if it's done by American Buddhists. It kind of have a ramification globally. And that is a way of participating in global citizenship, the way I see it, right? I mean, it does not necessarily, global citizenship does not mean that you should really go all over the world. That is not even possible, right? So how to really think about what are our way, 21st century way of creating a solidarity, right? And there, I would like to think about this kind of going back to the existential foundation of our existence. I hope this answered your question.
Professor May.
Thank you very much, Jean. I very much enjoyed your talk. And I am curious about the radical equality of all, right, in your claim, and how Buddhism then, in its attempt to eliminate or eradicate suffering, might deal with conflicts. So if there are conflicts, right, between different people or groups when it comes to their suffering, so that you can't address all of their sufferings at the same time, how would you then prioritize one over the other if they were all equal, right? That's one question. And the other concerns the origin of suffering in Buddhism, which, as you know, is desires, right? So what would, you know, this do with, I mean, how would this Buddhist, right, virtue of, you know, eliminating one's desires come in your proposal to apply, right, the elimination of suffering? Would we then need to persuade everyone to, right, give up their desires, especially, right, the desires for materialistic goods and so forth? How's that going to happen in, right, the real world? Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for the question, Lei. So we have to, in order to answer this question, we have to get into a little bit more Buddhist philosophy, but not too much getting into that side. The first question, if everybody's equal, when there are conflicts, how you gonna resolve the problem, right? So, I mean, I don't see there are any conflict between the radical equality claim and then resolving conflict resolution, because when if one is engaged with conflict resolutions, it also has to do with what kind of path you would take for that first. What are the contexts of that conflict, right? So I cannot just lay out overall rules to how to resolve conflict. But the radical equality means that everybody has a capacity to work to get rid of suffering. In other words, everybody has a capacity to improve themselves, create a better version of themselves. Obviously, in the process of all these things, there conflicts arise, right? And then the arise of conflict is not based on the radical equality. I think these are two different kind of theses. But I think that this conflict resolution should be, you have to consider various contexts. But in the context of my talk, the important part is that what would be your first kind of measurement to deal with the resolution? And in this case, from Buddhist perspective, it would be suffering, right? How do you minimize the suffering for others and for yourself, right? That would be the kind of first principle to deal with this conflict. Right? So that comes even before who's right, who's wrong. It might sound a little bit of problematic, but then that is a Buddhist approach to ethics, right? Morality. Origin of suffering, a desire, that's true. But then I don't think that this teaching of a kind of detachment means that you are not engaged with anything. If we do not engage with anything, we are dead, right? As far as you are alive, we constantly have certain kind of a desire, but it is an issue of what is the level of your desire. So having a desire is one thing, getting attached to your desire is another. But at the same time, one should constantly reflect upon whether your desire, even the desire to practice equality, the desire to pursue justice, right, should be constantly being checked, right? So actually, Joseph Chan, in the same book that I mentioned, he says this, right? We usually think that if virtue is good, then we should kind of emphasize virtue all the time. And he says that, well, if a virtue has power, like any power, virtue needs to be checked, right? And in the history, we see a lot of cases that people emphasize self-righteousness, which becomes a totalitarian vision. So I think that is a different thing, right? So having a desire is one thing, and having attachment to desire. So this is why cultivation is so important. Even when you do good things, you want to do good things for other people, but still that could be a poison rather than remedy.
Professor Wang Hui. Professor Wang.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you. I just wonder, I'm really interested in the elaboration of the idea radical equality. Can you elaborate a little bit more about these concepts, the Buddhist idea of equality with some other, now the all different generations of concepts of the equality, like for example, the Professor Walter's idea, complex equality, and so on and so forth. And also suffering issue is very important. But when we talk about the equality, and because based on the human being, the citizenship, and so on and so forth, what about our relation to the future generation, which will integrate the issue of climate change or ecological issue, all these not necessarily animals, but also the living condition were integrated into the consideration of equality issue. I mean, most of the equality idea was about the relationship between the human beings. What about the the future generation? They are non-existent anymore. So in any way, so how can you elaborate these kind of idea, radical equality?
Yes, thank you very much. So radical equality is my expression about Buddhist kind of fundamental, the ontological scheme, right? So if we have idea is that the Buddha, the enlightened person, is higher than someone like me who's unenlightened, that's understandable. But in theory, in doctrine, the Buddhist idea is that the enlightened person, be Buddha, and unenlightened being, they have same capacity. And that is a kind of counterintuitive. And that is why that as a Buddhist scholar, I've been wondering about this long time. That is, what does Buddhism want to say by making this radically equal of the best version of ourselves and the just a normal or even worse version, even the worst version of ourselves have an equal capacity. And I think that there is a kind of a function of emphasizing radical equality, and it has to do, one of the function of this is a salvific power. So if you really think about religious or philosophical, the idea is that in order to improve ourselves, because we are finite being, we need someone else, something else, either God, transcendental being, or transcendental metaphysical foundation. If you do not accept that, like a Buddhism, the only way to do it is get human being, encourage human being, help themselves to improve. And I think this radical equality is the very idea to encourage people that you can do it, right? So try to improve yourself, even just a little bit. And in that case, so what is a kind of measurement for my improvement? And one of the key measurement is suffering. Whether you cause suffering to other people, other beings, then you'd better not go that direction. And whether your action will minimize suffering of other people and yourself, that's the path you should take. And this one is related to your question about the climate change and the next generation, right? Obviously, by kind of constantly making the situation worse for environmental issues, we are constantly creating suffering for the future generation who are not here yet. So that is why that the climate issue need to be addressed at this point. Otherwise, we are constantly increasing the possibility of suffering, not only for ourselves, but as you said, the future generation who didn't even get engaged with this kind of messing up with the nature.
Amita.
Yes.
Amita.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. First, congratulations to Professor Park for a wonderful presentation, and the way you began your paper, it's really very impressive to bring out the logico-epistemic counterpart of the conflict. So I am interested to know that what will be the logico-epistemic counterpart of your proposal of the minimal morality of wisdom or removal of suffering. Would you say that a logic of intersectionality will somewhat give a sort of a support basis to your philosophy? Or would you say that this conflict resolution and all other problems will have to be dealt in the realm of, in the realm of existence. And we do not need to change our logic or logic of binaries. And if we move towards the logic of intersectionality, will that in any way help improving the situation or support your kind of resolution principle?
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. And then I really liked your talk last night when you talk about the nonviolence and things like that. So in my paper, I actually talk about this kind of problem of logic, which I didn't get into in my presentation. So if you really think about the Western logic, the simple logic, identity excluded the middle and the contradiction. And if you compare this to Buddhist logic, they are totally different. The Buddhist logic from the Western logical perspective is totally violating all the kind of logical assumptions. Therefore, when the Buddhism first came to the West, people thought that Buddhism or Asians do not know how to do logic, therefore they cannot do philosophy, right? So I do believe that the logic, the way we kind of think, teach, or imagine about logic is very important in the way we practice whatever ideas in reality. So with the kind of the principle of identity, we got the idea of autonomous individual who is not related to others, right? Other than just individual versus individual. Whereas from Buddhist logic, which is always a kind of interaction of relational identity, then you get the concept of idea of the self, which is always already connected with other beings, right? And if you really move from that direction, then the ethics are different, right? In the kind of the principle of identity, you get the ethics which emphasize autonomous ethical agency, whereas in the kind of Buddhist idea, you get the this idea of interconnectedness and the suffering and so on and so forth. Right? So I do think that the logic is important in the way that we imagine other parts of philosophical issues and actually practice various issues in our life.
Well, that's why I'm proposing a logic of intersectionality, which is coming up nowadays, especially in the feminist logic concept, and also in the context of information ethics. And
right,
so,
and I think that the logical intersectionality perhaps will be very close to what Buddhism called four-cornered logic. So identity is not just identity, but identity is difference and so on and so forth. So you can put them together, right? So obviously there are differences when we talk about intersectionality, which kind of combination of different factors of our existence. But yes, I think that has a lot of similarity with Buddhist logic, four-cornered logic.
thank
Thank you very much.